Police department, search warrant, come to the door.
We've seen the raid of Bryan Kohberger's apartment from the outside, but now we're getting a look inside that apartment through crime scene photos just released. The photos tell a story and show us what Kohberger was writing and reading before he murdered 4 University of Idaho students. I go through all of the photos. Welcome to Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. When Bryan Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, law enforcement was ready to go with a search warrant for his apartment in Pullman, Washington, more than 2,500 miles away. Now, I'm sure they were hoping that they would find some forensic evidence connecting him to the murders of Maddie Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xander Cornoto, and Ethan Chacon, but they did not find any, not one speck. Washington State University Police helped execute the warrant. I spoke with Police Chief Gary Jenkins about it back in July. Take a look.
The apartment was sparse. It didn't look like someone was actively living there. It was almost to the point where someone maybe was not planning to come back. So it was not a typical occupied type of an apartment.
Interesting. So, no clothes hanging in the closet, or was it just no books, or was there furniture, or could you describe
there was some furniture, very few clothes, not even a shower curtain. I don't recall if there were any books there, but there was just very little.
Now, Chief Jenkins was right. The photos show there wasn't a lot in that apartment. This is Kohberger's living room. There's a love seat and a TV. There's also a closet. And inside that closet, it was pretty messy. But what was there was interesting given what we know now. The living room is sparse for sure. There's a love seat and a TV with an entertainment center and a small coffee table. The love seat was across from the TV with a closet to the side. Now, how often Kohberger sat and watched TV? We just don't know. Inside the closet, there was a vacuum cleaner. CSIs photographed it and marked it as evidence, and they didn't know at that point what it could contain. They even photographed the canister that collects all of the stuff that it sweeps up. It ended up not having anything of evidentiary value in it, but I can tell you that Kohberger's downstairs neighbor told me that he would often vacuum in the middle of the night, waking her and her small children up. The closet shelves were full of papers, boxes, and other junk as if it had just been tossed in there haphazardly. It didn't appear to be in any order at all. On the other side of the closet, there was a black nitrile glove. It was photographed, and there were a couple of these. Remember, the killer was described as wearing all black. Also in the closet, a receipt from Walmart for a Dickies beanie, and receipts from Marshall's in Moscow from August and September. Investigators also photographed a Target receipt from July 4th. That Target is in Moscow. Kohberger bought a Fire Stick. Kohberger also received a number of parking tickets. Those were found in the apartment and photographed. He had told a professor he found a way to outsmart the parking attendants. Inside Kohberger's entertainment center, there were a number of books just kind of shoved in there. The topics all appear to be related to criminology. Investigators laid the books out to photograph them. Some of the titles were discussed in Kohberger's papers, and they seem kind of ironic given the position he's in now. Mass Incarceration on Trial. Another book is entitled Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free. One, Let the Lord Sort Them Out. But one stood out to me given Kohberger's interest in sexual burglary and his interest in discussing Ted Bundy and the Chi Omega murders, according to an interview with one of his classmates. This book was entitled Unsafe in the Ivory Tower, The Sexual Victimization of College Women. The book discusses how women react when they're sexually victimized. The book was shipped to the owner in 2012, according to the receipt that is with it. Kohberger wrote about research topics, offender decision-making, emotionality, and burglary with theft/material gain as the end. In one line, Kohberger wrote he intended to go into a prison to conduct research. The topic will be probed by way of in-person, semi-structured interviews in a correctional setting. The professor indicated that he or she would have a lot to say about that. Now, Kohberger's writing is pretty formal and wonky. He was told by one professor to avoid flowery language. In another assignment, he reviewed a professor's work on sex offenders' myopic decision-making. There's a reason Crime Fix is one of the top-ranked shows on YouTube right now, just like there's a reason why Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. They're a firm with more than 1,000 attorneys, and that's because they win a lot. Morgan & Morgan has recovered more than $25 billion from more than 500,000 clients. In the last few months, a client in Florida received $12 million after the insurance company offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, a client was awarded $26 million. That was 40 times the insurer's $650,000 offer. Another client in Pennsylvania received $29 million after being offered only $500,000. Even if you think your case is not worth millions, why not start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it truly so easy. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're ever hurt, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/crimefix by clicking the link below or scanning that QR code that you see on your screen. Investigators also photographed a number of papers and quizzes that Kohberger wrote. Most of his grades were in the 80s and 90s, but he was told on one assignment that he provided a lot of detail from the book, but needed to focus answering the question asked and only that. Another time, he was told his writing was difficult to understand and he needed to focus on shorter, punchier sentences. He wrote another paper about the death penalty and ethics. A little bit of irony there. Kohberger's classmates said he was the only student in their class who supported the death penalty. Kohberger's freezer and refrigerator contained a number of vegan foods, including frozen pizza, tater tots and almond milk, and vegan cheese. The freezer looks in parts as if the food is just kind of shoved inside the door. The bedroom showed Kohberger's bed and closet. There were a number of shirts hanging in the closet and a few pairs of jeans, along with some other items for bedding, but not much else, just some hangers. Also in the bedroom, a computer on the desk. Around the computer, there was a bunch of dust as if it hadn't been cleaned in a while. Then there's the bathroom, where Kohberger took that selfie the morning of the murders. You can see the mirror where he took that selfie, and the tub and tile appear to be very clean. There's no shower curtain. His lawyers would later say he threw it away frequently to prevent mold from growing. Investigators pulled apart the drain from the tub, probably hoping to find some DNA, but they didn't find any belonging to the victims. Again, there are few personal items, if any, in the bathroom. Back in the living room, investigators found some cards addressed to Bryan Kohberger. One says, "Both of your egos, you are dino and a professor, LMAO. Speak softly and carry a big stick unless you can ride a dinosaur. Then do that instead." Apparently, it's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and this was a birthday card. Inside, it was addressed to Bryan, dated 11/21/2022, his birthday a little more than a week after the murders. That and a card from his mother are really the only two personal items in the apartment. It reads, "A son leaves your home, but never your heart. He discovers his own happiness, which in turn becomes yours." Now, we know that Bryan Kohberger was a huge problem in the criminology department at Washington State University. He had 13 complaints lodged against him by students and the faculty. They wanted to get rid of him big time. Some of these complaints were for sexual harassment. On November 2nd, that was actually 11 days before the homicides, he was given an improvement plan, told to meet with his advisor every week, and he was supposed to show the work that he was doing. So to talk about these new photos that we're seeing inside of Bryan Kohberger's apartment, I want to bring in Bobby Chacon. He's a retired FBI agent, also an attorney. Bobby, thanks so much for coming on. What strikes you first when you look through these photos of Bryan Kohberger's apartment?
Well, I think how Spartan it was, how little personality, if you will, was. I mean, there was a few maybe kind of birthday cards or greeting cards, but very few. Nothing on the walls, which, on one hand, I know that, I've lived the undergraduate life in a dorm, and he was in graduate student housing, which, is always a little, lower end. It usually comes furnished with cheap furniture and not a lot, in way of aesthetics. But a lot of times you personalize it yourself, even a little house plant or something. And this was nothing. It was nothing there. Now, granted, these pictures are taken, he had time to kind of clean out things and get rid of things. And But I was really struck by like just how sparse it was, how, there was nothing personal. There just seemed to be no personality. We know now about the personality type and stuff, and it just seemed to fit this person who like didn't have any friends, didn't have any social life. There was just nothing there. It was just books, which were used in his studies, and maybe one or two greeting cards, one from his mom, maybe, but that's it. It was very, very sparse.
Yeah, very, very sparse. I mean, not a photograph of anybody. For as close as he was, apparently, we know from talking to Celebrate digital experts, they examined his phone. His mother and father were his two main points of contact in his life. He started his day talking to them. He texted them throughout the day. They tucked him in at night, basically via phone. Not even a photo of mom and dad, anywhere, siblings, anything. Nothing personal at all. I think that his attorneys would say, well, he has level 1 autism. Maybe it's a function of that. I would say this is somebody who lived in his own head based on what we know. He lived a fantasy life in his own head, fantasizing about what he was going to do based on what we know from his Google searches about non-consensual pornography, the dressing up like this Ted Bundy-esque character, I guess, from this show he watched on YouTube. I mean, wouldn't you say that's probably a little more accurate?
Yeah, the only photograph that I saw that kind of looked kind of lived in, if that kind of term, like was his desk with his computer and his bed right next to it. It wasn't even a very fancy bed or anything. It was just like he lived his life looking at that computer and then going to bed. Like it was the only area of the house that I'm not going to say it looked normal, but it looked like somebody lived there. The rest of it, that place could have been abandoned months ago. It didn't look like anybody lived there in months. And this is probably only weeks after he was arrested when they went in. I don't know the exact dates, but it was
like the day he was arrested.
It was the day he was arrested. So a couple of weeks after he left for Pennsylvania, maybe less. So that was the thing. The only thing that you could tell, like he spent time sitting at that desk, looking at that computer and kind of in the bed right next to it. Like that was the only, you could see that's where he spent the majority of his time in that place.
Yeah. And that computer, when I looked at it close up, at least to me, I mean, it looks pretty high end. I don't know. I'm not a computer expert, but it just seems like the computer, the phone, the bed. I think you're right. I mean, that is like how he lived his life. And then what struck me too is this whole thing about him being a vegan and just his freezer and his fridge are stocked full of like almond milk, vegan pizzas, vegan this, vegan that. It was kind of haphazard too, for somebody who allegedly has obsessive compulsive disorder. I guess, that everything's just kind of shoved into the door of the freezer. And I know some people will say, well, that was, maybe about personal hygiene with his hour-long showers and stuff like that. But it just seems like he's kind of messy in some spots. We all have our messes, I guess. But, that closet's all messy with all the paperwork and everything. And then you've got the freezer and stuff like that. It just seems kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, it didn't look like someone who was obsessive compulsive to me. You could argue that he might have moved out in a hurry. He might have taken, a photograph of his mom and dad and packed it up. And when he drove across country, the hangers in the closets look a little bit disheveled. So he may have left in a hurry. He might have packed up and got out of there, knowing what he had done and knowing the noose was kind of getting tighter. But yeah, the things that he left behind certainly didn't indicate to me a very organized, hyper structured kind of person. Because like you said, I thought the same thing when I saw the stuff in the refrigerator and freezer. Like it wasn't like aligned. It wasn't, organized by color or type of food. Like somebody with true obsessive compulsive disorder would, if they left anything behind, they would leave it very, very well organized and structured. And I didn't see a whole lot of that in these photographs.
Yeah, I didn't see that at all either. It just seemed very much like, okay, here you go. Like shove it in the fridge, throw my paperwork into the closet, and even the books shoved into the entertainment center. I want to talk about these books. Obviously, he was a criminology student, so we're going to have books, textbooks about things related to the criminal justice system, criminology. But one that really piqued my interest was this one that was about the sexual victimization of women, unsafe in the ivory tower. And this book, was shipped in 2012, according to the receipt. Now, that could have just been stuck in there. Maybe he bought it at the bookstore. I don't know. I don't know how long, because there are redactions on the receipt. I don't know how long he's had it. But this book talks about how women react when they're victimized on college campuses, when they're sexually victimized on college campuses. A lot of these other books we see referenced in his schoolwork. This one, pretty interesting to me. This could have been a book he was simply just interested in, given the fact that he was fascinated by apparently sexual burglary, according to his studies and according to interviews with Washington State faculty and staff. That was his area of study, sexual burglary, and he liked to talk about that. So does that book pique your interest at all as somebody who investigates crimes?
Yeah, I mean, as an investigator, the first thing I would have done with those books is I would have taken the list of books and I would have matched it against his curriculum. So the courses he was taking and the courses he was teaching or helped teach as a teacher's assistant, graduate teacher assistant, look at all the courses that he either took in the past, even if he didn't take them at that school, because sometimes you keep books from prior schools, and the courses that he was helping teach now, and look at both the required reading and recommended reading, and then cross them off the list. So all of these books here were, part of his education, part of his academic studies and work. And then you have possibly extras that were not part of the either recommended or required reading. That's the first thing I would do. And I would look at the list of basically elective books that he had that weren't required by any of these courses or even recommended by any of these courses. But the thing why that's not necessarily totally accurate in this case is because, like you said, he actually pursued certain academic courses that might have been feeding into his psychosis. And so, you can't just see that book and then say, oh, well, it was required reading in this course, check, and then move on, because maybe he took that course because it fed into his fantasies, because it fed into his criminal fantasies or whatever. And so this case has that extra layer. Normally, I would look at the books and go, okay, here's the ones they wanted to read rather than they had to read. But in this case, he might have been pursuing academic courses and to help teach academic courses that were feeding into that psychosis.
There's also another one, it's so interesting to me to look at some of these books. I mean, he's now pleaded guilty, and obviously he was a criminal justice major. So he was writing about some of this stuff in his papers. And in some of the papers, these books are referenced, these texts are referenced. But what was interesting to me, we have Mass Incarceration on Trial. That was one of the books. Why the Innocent Plead Guilty. I mean, that's going to get there are still some people out there, Bobby, that think he's innocent despite him pleading guilty. That's going to get his supporters all riled up. But it's just interesting to me that he's reading these books and then goes out and commits a quadruple homicide.
Yeah, I think that now looking back, and I discount the Kohbergers, the people you're referring to. I think I've heard them referred to it. Yeah, the Kohbergers, which is kind of an apropos name. But I think that part of his studies now, looking back at it, were feeding into his fantasies. That was the way he was, because we know a lot of times these killers, they often enjoy the hunt of people, like the lead up to the actual crime also feeds into them. Well, this guy had a much longer and much more extensive lead up to this murder, in that he was studying all this stuff. He was probably finding pleasure in reading about women who were sexually victimized during burglary, say, or even talking about it to women. We know over and over again, we've seen interviews of women that said, I felt uncomfortable just talking to this guy. So I think that he had that in him. And all of this was feeding and not only feeding into, but leading up to, that night at 1122 King Road.
We also, in this thing, have his improvement plan. The staff, the faculty had met with him and said, look, there are issues with you. He was put on notice that there were issues with him. He was even suspicious, according to some of the interviews with his classmates, that he was going to be kicked out of the program or at least lose his TA position, which would mean his funding would be cut. And he probably wouldn't be able to afford to stay in school. And on November 2nd, this is 12 days before the homicides, he's given an improvement plan where he has to meet with the supervisor, in an established meeting time. I mean, this is like all very this is what you do. You meet with your supervisor when they tell you to. Keep track of weekly hours and provide report to supervisor. Establish weekly goals with supervisor and discuss whether previous week's goals were met. All of this stuff. So they had him on an improvement plan. I mean, this happens just 11 days before the homicides. Does this speed up his? Yeah,
he was definitely devolving, if you will. I think both in his focus and his work, and maybe because he was thinking about what he was going to be doing. And we had that in the FBI. We called it a 90-day file review. So every 3 months, your supervisor would bring you in. Your stack of cases would be on the desk. You'd go over, what did you do the last 90 days? What are you expecting to do the next 90 days? And what's your plan on all these cases? And they would mentor you and give you ideas and things and kind of review what you did. And then if you were a disciplinary problem, you'd be put on 60-day file reviews or 30-day file reviews. It would get shorter and shorter and shorter. It looks like they were having problems with him. And this was a disciplinary measure. Now, normally, it's probably not every week that you have to meet with your supervisor and say, this is what I did last week. These were my goals. These were the goals I met and didn't meet last week. And these are my goals for this week. I think they were kind of tightening the leash on him academically and, from an employment perspective, because he was not up to the tasks of doing whatever he was supposed to be doing for the university. This, to me, when I was reading the things that you just read off, it looked to me like a disciplinary measure that we got to keep you focused because you're all over the place. You're not doing your job. We're paying you and you're pursuing, these academic credentials and you're not keeping pace. And so now we're going to have you meet every single week, say what you did this past week, what you're going to do next week. That's, to me, like the leash was tightening. The university wasn't happy with him. Whoever supervises him and kind of monitors his work was not happy with him. And so it looks like this guy was unraveling.
He was unraveling, and they were preparing to get rid of him. They were concerned. They said it in the interviews. They were concerned about a civil lawsuit. One of the staff members said that. And so they were preparing to bounce him. And this was one of the ways in which they were going to do it. It's sad to me how many red flags there were about this guy. I'm not saying they could have said he was going to go out and commit a quadruple homicide, but they knew he was a problem and they feared he was a future predator. And it's just sad that they feared a civil suit and couldn't just bounce him and get him out of there sooner.
And he knew that. And he knew all of that. This is like what that thing you just read off to me was he's on notice now. Like they're pushing him out the door and he feels their hands on his back. And so that's probably their concern about there are certain people, we've all had coworkers that kind of seem discontent at work or whatever. But there are then these cases where you hear people say, yeah, he's the kind of guy that I knew, wouldn't take it well. He would, the term go postal because of all the, postal facility shootings we had when people gotten fired or disciplined or whatever. And so I think that, they were worried. I think they had a legitimate concern that this is a guy who's not going to take well to being disciplined, not going to take very well at all to being shown the door. And they had a real concern. Now, why is that? Because there are indicators that he doesn't deal well with that kind of stuff. And that's a problem. That's a red flag that it goes beyond the employment relationship to me. It goes to, is this person so emotionally or mentally unstable that we have a problem? And I have retired FBI friends who are in the business now of advising businesses on how you get rid of an employee without these kind of repercussions. And there are processes and procedures that are very well advised to be followed, so you don't have an incident. So you don't have to say somebody come back to an office with a gun and shoot their coworkers. And so these are specialists, and I have friends who are specialists in this field. And it seemed like the red flags you're talking about, somebody in that type of field should have been consulted and said, how do we handle this person if we think, and I get it, like nobody knows beforehand, but if you have that kind of inclination or that even concern, now what level of concern you have to have before you consult an expert or bring somebody in the employment and labor relations field that says, if this is a problem employee and you're thinking about getting rid of them, then here's how you should handle it. And I don't know that was done in this case. Academics tend to think that they know a lot about stuff that they don't. This is a labor and employment law type of procedure. This doesn't have to do with criminal justice. But there are experts, and I know some of them, that do advise companies and institutions. And if you have an employee that you feel is not going to take very well and might have a negative reaction to either discipline or termination, then you need to start early in the process consulting that expert and take the steps that they advise to minimize any damage that this person may cause. Now, I'm not saying that would have happened in this case, but there are clear indications, like you said, that they felt this person was an issue and let's just get rid of him. But the problem is, if you think he's an issue, getting rid of him may exacerbate that issue.
Right. I think this speeded up his plan.
It very well could have. I mean, look, we know his dad flew across country. He had the tickets already. He might have been planning on getting out of there, because he knew the hammer was going to fall. And he might have packed up a lot of stuff and had it, ready to go when his dad arrived and they got the heck out of there. And then, like you said, he thought, I'm not coming back here anyway, so I can do this heinous act and get out and not be around when the repercussions come down. That's also a possibility.
Very much so. Bobby Chacon, thank you so much, as always, for your time. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Investigators also searched Bryan Kohberger's office at Washington State University. It was pretty bare, and he shared it with other students. It's not believed that anything of any evidentiary value was found there. And that's it for this episode of Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. Thanks so much for being with me. I'll see you back here next time.